You're standing there beside your roses. That big first flush from June is fading fast. The petals are dropping onto the soil, and you're holding the shears, wondering exactly where to make the cut. Stop for 1 second. Where you place that cut in the next 2 weeks decides everything. It decides whether you get a second wave of roses in late summer or whether you get a big green bush that just sits there and sulks until the frost. Most gardeners cut in the wrong spot, and they never find out why their roses quit on them in July. I cut in the wrong spot for years. And there is one small detail, one thing on the stem you have to find before you cut, that separates a rose that blooms twice from a rose that blooms once and stops. Old rosarians knew it more than 150 years ago. Let me show you. I remember the summer I almost gave up on my oldest rose. She's a soft pink shrub my mother planted, and she must be close to 20 years old now. That July, she bloomed once beautifully, and then nothing. Green leaves, fat, healthy canes, not a single new bud. I fed her, I watered her, I begged her, nothing. And it wasn't until an old gardener leaned over my fence and looked at how I'd been snipping the dead flowers that I understood what I'd been doing wrong. It had nothing to do with feeding. It had everything to do with that one cut. So before you touch those shears, let me save you the years I wasted. Because this works just as well on a rose you've grown for 15 years as it does on one you planted this spring. Here's the first mistake, and I promise you, you are probably making it right now. When a rose flower fades, most of us do the natural thing. We reach in, we pinch off the dead bloom right at the top of the stem, just under the wilted petals, and we feel tidy and satisfied. The bush looks neater, we think we've deadheaded, but we haven't done anything useful at all. Snipping off just the flower head is not pruning, it's grooming. And a repeat flowering rose does not respond to grooming. It responds to a real cut, made in a real place, that sends a real signal down the stem. Here is what's actually happening inside that plant. When you leave a long bare stem with just the flower removed, the rose has no reason to push a strong new shoot. What you very often get instead is what growers call a blind shoot. That's a stem that grows out, looks fine, and then just ends in a little point with no flower bud at all. You wait, and it never blooms. I used to have a whole bush covered in these blind shoots by August, and I couldn't understand it. I thought the rose was tired. I thought maybe it was old. It wasn't old. It was confused, because I kept snipping little flower heads off the top and never gave it the signal it needed lower down. The Royal Horticultural Society is very clear about this, and once I read their guidance, it was like a light came on. You don't cut just below the flower. You cut down to the first strong, healthy leaf that has 5 leaflets on it. Now, stay with me here, because this is the part almost nobody explains properly. A rose leaf is not a single leaf. It's made up of several little leaflets on one stalk. Up near the flower, close to the top of the stem, you'll see leaves with only 3 leaflets. Those are the weak ones. Lower down the stem, you'll find leaves with 5 leaflets, sometimes 7. Those are the strong ones. The bud sitting in the joint where that 5-leaflet leaf meets the stem is a powerful bud, and it's the one that can actually produce a new flowering shoot. The little buds up by the 3-leaflet leaves usually can't. They give you those useless blind shoots, so the whole game changes with one decision. Instead of snipping the dead flower off the top, you follow the stem down with your eyes, past the 3-leaflet leaves, until you reach the first strong leaf with 5 leaflets. That's your target. That's the first half of the secret. But finding the 5-leaflet leaf is only the beginning, because there's something about that particular leaf, something about which one you choose and which direction it faces, that most people get backwards. And getting it backwards is exactly how you end up with a rose that grows into a tangled mess in the middle and refuses to bloom where you can actually see it. So let's talk about direction, because this is where good gardeners with the right idea still go wrong. You found your 5-leaflet leaves. Good. But there's usually more than one going down the stem, and they face different ways. Some point in toward the center of the bush, some point out toward the open air. And here's the thing, the old rose growers understood that the quick, tidy-up crowd never learns. The new shoot always grows in the direction the bud is pointing. Always. So if you cut just above a bud that points inward, that new shoot grows straight into the middle of the plant. Do that to a dozen stems, and by late summer, you've got a bush stuffed full of crossing branches. No air moving through the center, damp leaves, and the perfect conditions for black spot and mildew. The blooms you do get are buried inside where you can't even enjoy them. But if you choose a five-leaflet leaf whose bud points outward, away from the center, that new shoot grows out into the light in the air. The bush opens up like a vase. Every new flowering stem grows where the sun can reach it and where you can see it from the window. This is why I tell you to slow down. You are not just cutting off a dead flower. You are steering the entire shape of the plant and deciding where your next roses will appear. When I finally understood this, I stopped rushing through deadheading in 5 minutes. Now I take my time with each stem, find the outward-facing five-leaflet leaf, cut about a 1/4 inch, that's roughly half a centimeter, above that bud on a slight slant so water runs off away from the bud. That slant matters more than you'd think, because water pooling on a fresh cut invites rot right down into the stem. Now, there's a depth question too, and this is the piece that took me the longest to trust. You might find your first outward-facing five-leaflet leaf fairly high up, and the stem there might still be quite thin, thinner than a pencil. My instinct for years was to cut high and take off as little as possible, because it felt safer. It felt like I was protecting the plant. But thin stems produce weak, half-hearted regrowth, and very often more of those blind shoots that never flower. The old growers had a simple rule that I now follow every single time. Cut back to where the stem is at least as thick as a pencil thickness or better. If your first outward-facing five-leaflet leaf sits on wood thinner than a pencil, keep going down until you reach wood that's good and firm. Yes, it feels like you're removing a lot. You're removing more than deadheading. But that firmer wood has the strength to push a real flowering shoot, and that is the entire point of summer pruning a repeat rose. You are not tidying, you are triggering. I know this feels aggressive the first time. I stood over my mother's pink shrub with the shears, and I genuinely hesitated because I was cutting into healthy green stems with good leaves still on them. It goes against everything that feels gentle and kind. But roses are not delicate in the way we imagine. They are tough, wild-hearted plants, and a confident cut into pencil-thick wood is exactly the wake-up call they want in the middle of summer. Within a couple of weeks, I saw fat red new shoots pushing out from those outward-facing buds, and every single one of them was heading somewhere useful. That was the summer she came back. That was the summer I stopped losing the second flush. Now, here's where the tension really starts, because timing is not a suggestion with this. There is a window, and the window is not open all season. In most of the United States and across the United Kingdom, your first big flush of roses comes and goes through June and into early July. The moment those flowers are clearly finished, spent, and dropping, that is when the clock starts. You want to make these cuts within a week or two of the flush fading, and you generally want your last serious summer pruning done by roughly the middle to end of August in cooler regions or a bit later in warm southern gardens. Why does the deadline matter so much? Because a rose needs somewhere between 6 and 8 weeks from the time you cut to grow a new shoot, form a bud, and open a flower. If you do the math on that, you can see the danger. Cut too late, and the second flush tries to open right as the cold arrives, and it either gets ruined by the first frost or never opens at all. All that effort wasted, because the cut came 3 weeks too late. That's the part that keeps me out in the garden in the heat of July when I'd rather be sitting in the shade. I know that every week I delay is a week stolen from the second bloom. So the moment I see that first flush fading, I get out there with the shears, I find my outward-facing five-leaflet leaves, I cut back to pencil-thick wood, and I get the clock ticking while there's still enough summer left to reward me. But maybe you're listening to all this and thinking, that's fine for someone starting fresh, but my rose is old. Maybe it's been in the ground for 10, 15, 20 years. Maybe it's gotten leggy and bare at the bottom, with all the growth crammed up at the top like a tree on a stick. Maybe it barely bloomed at all this year, and you're quietly afraid it's on its way out. I want you to lean in now, because this next part is for you especially. This is for the tired old rose you're not ready to give up on. Because an established rose that stopped performing is very rarely a dying rose. It's almost always a rose that's been groomed instead of pruned for years, and it's carrying a load of old, exhausted wood that's choking off its own energy. Here's what I do to bring one of these back, right in the middle of summer, without digging it up and without starting over. First, I look at the base of the plant, down where the canes come out of the ground. On an old, neglected rose, you'll usually find some canes that are gray, woody, cracked, maybe covered in old bark, clearly ancient, Those old canes take up water and food and give almost nothing back in blooms. In summer, after the first flush, I'll take out one, sometimes two, of the very oldest canes, cutting them right down low, close to the base, using a small pruning saw or loppers if they're thick. Just one or two. I don't strip the whole plant bare in the heat because that's a shock too far. But removing one old deadweight cane opens up room and light, and it tells the plant to send up a fresh young cane from the base, what growers call a basal break. And a fresh basal cane is a flowering machine for years to come. Then I go through the rest of the bush the way I described. Every spent flower stem cut back to an outward-facing five-leaflet leaf on pencil-thick wood. On a leggy old rose, don't be afraid to cut some of those long, thin, whippy stems back quite hard, down into firmer wood lower on the plant. It feels brutal. Do it anyway. I once took a bare-bottomed, sad old climber that hadn't bloomed properly in 3 years, cut out two of its oldest canes in July, cut everything else back to strong outward buds, and by September it had thrown up two brand new deep red basal canes as thick as my finger. The following summer it was the best it had looked in a decade. That rose was not dying. It was buried under its own old wood, and nobody had ever given it permission to start again. One more thing for the rescue job, and this is gentle, but it matters. When you cut into an old rose in summer, take a good look at the very center of the plant while you're in there. Pull out anything dead, anything brown and brittle, and any stems that are crossing and rubbing against each other, because a rubbing wound is an open door for disease. You want to be able to see daylight through the middle of the bush when you're done. Air moving through the center is one of the biggest favors you can do a mature rose, and it costs you nothing but a little patience with the shears. So now you've made the right cut, in the right place, facing the right way, at the right depth, and you've even rescued the tired old girl at the back of the border. But here's the next problem, and it's the one that trips up people who've done everything else perfectly. A cut alone is not enough. When you prune a rose in summer, you are asking it to do something enormous. You're asking it to grow a whole new set of shoots, leaves, buds, and flowers all over again in the second half of the season. That takes fuel, and if the fuel isn't there in the soil at the moment the plant is trying to respond to your cut, all that good pruning goes to waste, and you're right back to a green bush that won't bloom. So the moment I finish the summer prune, I feed. Not with just any random plant food. And this is where people go wrong again. In spring, we often feed roses with something that pushes leafy green growth, lots of nitrogen. But in midsummer, when you want flowers and not just more leaves, you want a feed that's richer in potassium, sometimes called potash. Potassium is the nutrient that drives flowering and strong stems. A proper rose feed, or even a tomato feed which is high in potassium, works beautifully here. I scatter a granular rose feed around the base of each plant, following the amount on the label, keeping it off the stems, and then I gently work it into the top of the soil with my fingers or a hand fork. And this is the step people skip in the summer heat because they're tired and hot and want to go inside, I water it in deeply. Not a light sprinkle over the leaves, a slow, deep soak right at the base of the plant, enough to carry that feed down to the roots where it's needed. A rose that's just been pruned and fed but left dry in July will stall. It simply won't have the moisture to move those nutrients or to push soft, new growth. I water in the early morning or the evening, never in the blazing midday sun, and I water the soil, not the foliage, because wet leaves in the heat are asking for disease. Right after I feed and water, I mulch. A layer of well-rotted compost or manure, a couple of inches thick, roughly 5 centimeters, spread around the base but kept an inch or two back from the actual stems so it doesn't cause rot where it touches the wood. That mulch does 3 jobs at once. It locks moisture into the soil so your deep watering lasts. It keeps the roots cool through the hottest weeks, and it slowly feeds the plant as it breaks down. This combination, the cut, the potassium feed, the deep water, and the mulch, all done together within a day or two of each other, is what actually powers a real second flush. Do the cut but skip the fuel, and you've only done half the job. I learned that the hard way too. The summer I pruned perfectly, patted myself on the back, went on holiday for 2 weeks in a heat wave, and came back to a bone-dry bed and a rose that produced almost nothing. The cut was right. The support wasn't there. Never again. So now you know the cut, the direction, the depth, the timing, and the fuel. And honestly, if you do only that, you'll get more roses this summer than you've had in years. But I promised you one more thing at the start. I promised you the piece that the old Rosarians knew, the piece that got buried under all the quick, tidy modern advice about just snipping off dead flowers. And this is the one that turned my mother's exhausted 20-year-old shrub into the plant that stops people on the pavement. Here it is. There was an English clergyman named Samuel Reynolds Hole, known to everyone in the rose world as Dean Hole, and in 1869 he wrote one of the most beloved rose books ever published, called A Book About Roses. He grew hundreds of varieties and won the great rose shows of Victorian England, and the growers of his time understood something about mid-season that we've mostly forgotten. It wasn't only about cutting the top. It was about waking up the base. And the traditional trick that generations of careful rose growers used, and that quietly got passed down through old gardening circles long after it dropped out of the mainstream books, is a summer feeding of Epsom salts. Plain Epsom salts, magnesium sulfate, the same stuff people soak tired feet in. Now, here's why it works, and why it's the perfect partner to everything I've told you. Magnesium is at the very center of the chlorophyll molecule, the green pigment that lets leaves turn sunlight into energy. Roses are hungry feeders, and by midsummer, especially in sandy or heavily watered soils, magnesium often runs low. When it does, you see it. The older, lower leaves start yellowing between the veins while the veins stay green, and the plant loses steam right when you need it to power a second flush. But there's a second, almost magical effect that the old growers prized above all. A summer dose of magnesium encourages the plant to send up those fresh basal canes, the strong new shoots right from the bottom of the plant that carry the very best flowers. It doesn't just green up the leaves, it wakes the whole plant at the root. Here's exactly how I do it, and it costs almost nothing. For an established rose, I take about 1 tablespoon of Epsom salts, dissolve it fully in a gallon of water, that's roughly 4.5 liters, and I pour it slowly around the base of the plant, over the root zone, once after that first flush fades in summer. Some old growers did it twice, once in spring and once in midsummer. But if you only do it once, do it now, right when you make your summer cut. I apply it the same week I prune and feed, so the plant gets everything at once. The wake-up cut, the potassium for flowers, the deep water, and the magnesium to green the leaves and push new basal growth. That combination is the whole secret, and the Epsom salts are the quiet ingredient almost nobody mentions anymore. If you want every detail of this system laid out season by season, from first bud to late autumn, I've written it all down in my books, First Bloom, Deep Roots, and the Full Bloom System. Together, they walk you through the complete cycle of rose care the way the old growers practiced it, with the specific cuts, feeds, and timing decisions for every stage of the year. You'll find the links in the description below, and I think you'll recognize every page as the kind of knowledge that used to get passed quietly over garden fences, finally written down in one place. Now let me take you back to the moment I stood over my mother's pink shrub and put all of this into practice. I was skeptical the first time. I'll be honest with you, it sounded like an old wives' tale, like a folk remedy that couldn't possibly matter. But there was my mother's pink shrub, the one I'd nearly given up on, and I had nothing to lose. I made the cuts to the outward-facing 5-leaflet leaves. I fed her the potassium, I soaked her deeply, and I poured that dissolved tablespoon of Epsom salts right over her roots. Within about 3 weeks, the yellowing lower leaves deepened back to green, and then I saw it, a thick red new cane pushing straight up out of the base, the first basal break she'd made in years. By early September, she was carrying a second flush of pink that I could see from my kitchen window, and I stood there with my coffee nearly in tears because I'd been ready to dig her out the year before. That's the plant this saved. That's why I'm leaning over this fence telling you, and it makes sense that it works, because it isn't magic and it isn't a trick. It's the plant's own chemistry. Magnesium for the leaves, potassium for the flowers, a confident cut to the right bud to steer the growth, water to carry it all, and the right window of summer to give the new shoots time to bloom before the cold. The knowledge was there all along, written down by a Victorian dean who won rose shows more than 150 years ago, kept alive by careful growers who passed it quietly over their own fences, and lost to most of us under a pile of advice that told us to do nothing more than pinch off the dead heads. Now you have it, and you can do every bit of it this weekend. So this is what I want you to feel walking away today. Your roses are not tired, and they are not finished, and that quiet bush that bloomed once and stopped, is not beyond saving. It has a second bloom still in it, waiting for the right cut and the right fuel at the right moment, and now you know exactly how to give it. You are the kind of gardener who doesn't give up on a plant just because a lazy piece of advice let it down. You're the kind who kneels down, looks closely, finds the outward-facing five-leaflet leaf, and does it properly. That's who this is for. Now do one thing for me. Tell me in the comments which rose you're going to treat first this summer. Is it an old climber that's gone bare at the bottom, or a shrub rose your mother or grandmother planted, or a bright bush by the front door that bloomed once installed? Tell me its color, tell me how many years you've had it, and tell me where in the world you're gardening from, because I read these and I love knowing whose roses we're saving together. Go ahead and leave that comment now before you head out to the garden, so I know you're in. And if you're the kind of gardener who refuses to let a beloved plant die from bad, generic advice, then stay close to me here, because that's exactly who this little community is for. We share the real, specific, old-fashioned knowledge that actually keeps these plants alive through every season. Next time, I'm going to show you what to do with your roses in early autumn. The one late season feeding mistake that quietly weakens the whole plant going into winter, and the exact moment you must stop deadheading and start letting those hips form instead. Get that timing wrong and you undo everything we did today, so don't wander off. Grab your shears, find that five-leaflet leaf, and let's get your second flush of roses blooming before this summer slips away. Before you set those shears down, let me help a little more. Inside the Blooming Garden Circle, I take you through the full summer pruning method, cut by cut, right where this video stopped. Ask me your own rose questions too, and I answer you myself. Not some machine. You won't be alone. You'll belong with fellow gardeners already inside. Just point your phone's camera at the code and you can cancel anytime. Now, let me show you how to bring your clematis back to life this July. Even the ones that look completely dead can bloom again with one simple step. It's starting right here. Stay with me.